Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Good. Good to hear it. Um, okay, so I guess what we're doing today is we're going to be listening to a Freakonomics podcast. For anybody who's not familiar, they mostly talk about like sociology and behavioral economics. And they did a recent episode about compassion and apparently implying that there's a compassion crisis, which I I wonder what they're gonna have to say about that. I don't know. The topic piqued my curiosity, and I thought it would be something different that we could try out. Do you have anything you want to add before we get started on that? Or...
Yeah, I don't follow their stuff super closely anymore, but I'm generally a fan of the Freakonomics guys. I feel like they bring a lot of good ways to turn sort of intangible conversations about social problems into give us like 10 to take those conversations and give sort of good points to grapple over to try and understand the problem, because I think that's a real problem sometimes in conversations when you talk about these problems that are very vague. It's difficult to have specifics, and then it's difficult to try and to have real discussions for actionable information. So generally, I like their stuff. I'm curious. I think the main thing going in is when they say a compassion crisis, what exactly does that mean? Because I don't know. On the one hand, I think people really sometimes overestimate, oh God, the sky is falling, billions must die, the West is over, blah, 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 blah. And, it's the classic adage, everyone thinks they're living in, the most important times of history. But sometimes you are living in the most important times of history. And I think there are a couple good data points, suggest that, we're not dealing with the end of the world, but we certainly are dealing with a very, important problem in regards to social media and the way it sort of has eroded, I think, a lot of like the social fabric or social glue of our society. But then it's really difficult to like get into specifics. Why is that happening? Is it because of the internet? Is the internet just channeling it? So I'm really curious to hear what they have to say, because I think it's a problem that a lot of people acknowledge, but I haven't heard lots of people talk about, but no one has a really good solution for.
I mean, my answer going into this, but what I currently believe is that the internet has contributed to this, but that it predated the internet.
Yeah.
We live in a very atomized society in the West, just very antisocial. People keeping to themselves in their own houses and experiencing a lot of social alienation. So, I don't know. I'm ready for it whenever you are.
Right on.
Hey there. Since you are listening to this, you have found the YouTube channel for the Freakonomics Radio Network. If you are already a subscriber, thanks. If not, I hope you will consider becoming one. All you have to do is hit the button that says, subscribe. And if you want to enable notifications, go ahead and do that too. That way, you will be the first to know every time we publish something new. If you are new to the Freakonomics Radio podcast, my name is Stephen Dubner, and every week we explore the hidden side of everything, from the economics of sleep to the future of work, from the markets for marriage to the surprising life-saving contribution of wolves. So stay with us, and thanks for checking us out. If you like it, tell your friends. If you hate it, tell your enemies. And now, Freakonomics Radio. Today's episode is really interesting. There are two ways we could start it, but I can't decide which is better. One way is nasty and vulgar, like this.
Well, why are you looking then, retard?
Or we could start with the uplifting story, like this.
Scientists define compassion as an emotional response to another's pain or suffering, involving an authentic desire to help.
I don't know. I can't make up my mind. What do you think? All right, let's just flip a coin. Heads for nasty, tails.
Well, one
for
of those
uplifting.
fits into Twitch poll much
And
better
it's
than
tails.
the other.
Okay, we'll get to the nasty stuff later. So let's start here.
My name is Anthony Mazzarelli. I'm the co-president and CEO of Cooper University Healthcare.
The Cooper Health System takes in about $1.4 billion in annual revenues.
We're a level 1 trauma center located our core hospital in Camden, New Jersey, but we have over 100 sites.
Mazzarelli doesn't just run the hospital.
I'm also a practicing emergency medicine physician.
People who know Mazzarelli call him Maz, and Maz is sort of an overachiever. During his medical training, for instance, at the University of Pennsylvania,
I ended up graduating with a medical degree, a law degree, and a master's in bioethics. and then did my residency training in emergency medicine here at Cooper and have not left Cooper since.
In 2014, Mazzarelli was promoted to chief medical officer.
And at that time, our institution had engaged a consultant.
The consultant did what consultants do and suggested ways for the hospital to strengthen its bottom line. One idea: the hospital should focus on improving patient experience and physician engagement.
And there was a list of things to ask our physicians to do, which seemed, frankly, soft, things that were kind of mushy, things that I was concerned that I was going to have trouble getting 450, 500 faculty members. I was going to have trouble getting them to do.
Some of these mushy things had to do with the relationship between doctors and patients. Maz realized that most of what he was being asked to do was to get doctors to show more compassion. Now, you might assume that most people who choose medicine as a profession do so in part because they are compassionate, or at least that they're taught compassion during med school. If that's the case, where does it go? Does compassion somehow evaporate over time? If so, was there a viable way to increase it? And can compassion even be measured? Before doing anything, what Maz needed was some research.
So I turned to our number one NIH-funded researcher, the person with the most publications, the most NIH dollars.
I've been at Cooper for 17 years.
And it was Steve.
My name's Steve Treziak.
Treziak is the chairman and chief of the Department of Medicine at Cooper. And also,
I'm a research nerd, and I'm also a practicing intensivist, a specialist in intensive care medicine.
so here are two doctors, one specializing in intensive care, the other in emergency medicine, who between them had treated thousands of people who were each having one of the worst days of their lives.
So I never doubted that compassion was essential. And I don't know anyone in healthcare that feels otherwise, or at least no one that would admit to it. It's what we ought to do, the way we ought to treat patients. But does it actually move the needle on outcomes in a measurable way? That's what I was skeptical about.
But remember, the consultants the hospital brought in did want that needle moved. Mazzarelli was willing to consider that a dose of compassion might be worthwhile. So he reached out to Treziak
and sat with him and said, Steve, can you science this up for me? Can you look at the data around this? And he said, no, you're crazy. I don't want to be part of this. This is mushy. This is not what I do. I'm a hard science guy.
Is that indeed what you said, Steve?
It is, but that's because I didn't know there was such hard science available.
How much time did you think you'd have to waste on Maz's silly idea?
Well, it didn't take long before I started to see the beginning of the signal in the data, and that's when everything started to resonate.
What Treziak was seeing in the data resonated with something else that was happening in his life.
Where I sort of had an existential crisis, like, what am I going to do with my career? So I just want to be clear about one thing. I was not in the market for any sort of a scientific awakening. My research program was hitting every metric for success. We were publishing in some of the best journals. Everything was fine, right? But then I had this question that was posed to me.
He doesn't mean the question from Mazzarelli.
The question came from my son.
Treziak's son was 12 years old. The question actually came from a school homework assignment.
The question was, what is the most pressing problem of our time?
Treziak talked over the assignment with his son, but then on his own, he kept thinking about the question and how it applied to him.
I knew that the research that I was working on was very important, but I also knew that it wasn't the most pressing problem of our time. And I'm not old, but I'm too old to work on things that don't really matter. It led me to search for what is the most pressing problem of our time.
And after a couple weeks digging around in this seemingly mushy research project that Mazzarelli put him on, he knew he'd found it, what he considered the most pressing problem of our time, at least in his field.
What I found in the data and also just looking around at healthcare, what I see is that we have a compassion crisis. You can either believe it matters or it doesn't matter. But if it matters, how does it matter? How does it affect people? How does it affect healthcare? How does it affect the economics of healthcare? How does it affect healthcare providers and burnout?
Treziak and Mazzarelli wound up writing a book that tries to answer these questions. It is called Compassionomics, the revolutionary scientific evidence that caring makes a difference. Today on Freakonomics Radio, how strong is that evidence? How has the pandemic changed the equation? And is it just the healthcare system where we need more compassion?
From Stitcher and Dubner Productions, this is Freakonomics Radio, the podcast that explores the hidden side of everything. Here's your host, Stephen Dubner.
Okay, let's start by revisiting that definition of compassion. Stephen Trzeciak again.
Scientists define compassion as an emotional response to another's pain or suffering, involving an authentic desire to help.
That sounds like exactly what you're setting out to do if you become a nurse or a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant or a physician.
And the hypothesis is compassion matters. We don't just mean compassion matters in a moral or ethical or sentimental sense. We wanted to test the hypothesis that compassion matters in measurable ways for patients and for those who care for patients.
Here's one data point that Trzeciak and Mazzarelli cite in Compassionomics. When patients are asked what they consider extremely important traits in a doctor, 85% say yes to being treated with dignity and respect.
Only 27% say they want them trained in one of the best medical schools. Only 58% say has a lot of experience.
Anthony Mazzarelli again.
Patients want these factors that are more on the spectrum of empathy and compassion.
So we do want to be crystal clear about one thing. The number one driver of clinical outcomes is clinical excellence. If you're a surgeon and you botch the surgery, or if you're a physician who prescribes the wrong medication, there is no amount of compassion that's going to undo that.
Right.
It's not an either or, it's an and. So it's compassion and clinical excellence that produce the best clinical outcomes.
When you're going to look at data about the value and effect of compassion in medical care, how do you search for that? I'm guessing compassion is not a keyword in all these medical studies.
Yeah, it's a great question because you can look up pneumonia in PubMed. PubMed is the equivalent of Google. And you look up pneumonia, you'll get every article on pneumonia. If you were to look up compassion or empathy, you will not necessarily get every article. So we had to do something which was essentially the equivalent of the Dewey Decimal System. We had to go back and do a systematic review of a reference of references approach, pull articles, and then read all of those references, and then read the references of those articles, and then the reference of those articles, and keep doing that like a giant tree. That's why it took a couple years to do.
So rather than seeking out empirical evidence on compassion per se, Mazzarelli and Trzeciak organized their research around a set of characteristics that make up what is called patient-centered care. These include kindness, empathy, warmth, pretty much anything that shows doctors being nice to their patients. A lot of the research they looked at involved a 10-question survey called the CARE measure. Patients are asked questions like, how well did the doctor do at making you feel at ease? How well did the doctor do at fully understanding your concerns, at showing care and compassion, at making a plan of action with you? In seeking out evidence on patient-centered care, Mazzarelli and Trzeciak wound up reviewing 281 research articles that formed what they saw as a collage of evidence about the power of compassion. Before we hear your argument and your evidence for the argument, let me just ask, how persuaded are you that you're right? Because I could imagine that we could identify benefits of compassionate care, but it may be that, doctors show more compassion to patients who are more compliant. So how persuaded are you that the outcomes are not driven by something else, whether observable or unobservable?
Well, Steve used to have to correct me a lot on this because I am a lawyer also. He would always say to me, look, we're not making arguments. We're testing a hypothesis. He would say we need to be equally open that compassion isn't something that is measurable and meaningful.
Right. So it's important to recognize the difference between association and causation. And causation can only be inferred from certain study designs. But what is really compelling, and to specifically get to your question, when you push all the data together and you see it all curated, essentially for the first time, the signal is so consistent across the studies that it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to conclude anything else.
I kind of wonder if they're going to get into this, but when we talk about, causation, I'm curious what the mechanism is, because to me it almost makes sense from like almost tautologically that if you will, what is compassion? It's a deep caring, emotionally. If people care about something, if people are working on a thing and they care about it, it seems almost tautological that they would put more effort in or more care or just put more into that than if they didn't care. I'm curious, like what the specific distinction there is.
And there could be a placebo effect of it too, right? Where the placebo effect, for anybody that's not familiar with that, is where your body responds to medical treatments that aren't even real. Basically, like you can be given a fake pill and it'll sometimes actually help. And so like when people perceive that they are being cared for, I can imagine that might actually benefit their health a little bit. In addition to what you said, that like, compassion is probably an indication of the doctor's motivation too. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear some of the evidence that Trzeciak and Mazzarelli compiled.
Sure. So first, it's important to think about mechanisms. There are many broad categories by which compassion for patients can be beneficial. And the first is physiological. Compassion for patients can actually modulate a patient's perception of pain. It can have immune system effects. There are also endocrine effects, which means in patients with diabetes, there's evidence that they have better blood glucose control and fewer complications when they're treated with compassion on a regular basis. There's also broadly psychological effects. So compassion for patients can reduce symptoms of depression, reduce symptoms of anxiety, reduce emotional distress associated with somatic illnesses like having cancer.
Those are some amazingly concrete claims for something that both Trzeciak and Mazzarelli suspected might be mushy. So let's interrogate this evidence. Consider Trzeciak's first claim.
Compassion for patients can actually modulate a patient's perception of pain.
How did they reach that conclusion? Their book cites several research papers that take a variety of approaches. One was a randomized controlled trial done at Harvard Medical School with patients suffering from irritable bowel syndrome. It found that compassionate care, for instance, a doctor simply saying, "I can understand how difficult IBS is for you," this led patients to report significantly higher rates of symptom relief. Another study, this one from Michigan State University, also used a randomized experiment. That's the good news. The bad news is the subject pool was tiny, just 9 patients. In any case, these 9 patients were recruited from the waiting room of a primary care clinic and randomly divided into 2 groups. The control group got their standard visit with a doctor. The treatment group got the compassionate version, with the doctor engaging in warm conversation, trying to make the patient feel at ease, and encouraging follow-up questions. Afterward, the researchers put all 9 patients in an fMRI machine in order to measure their brain activity. Each patient was then given a painful stimulus while being shown an image of the doctor who'd seen them. The treatment group, that is the patients who'd received the compassionate care.
So that sounds like a little Black Mirror. Like you're just looking at like a portrait shot of your doctor and then like you get like electrocuted. I'm sure they would literally do that, but that's just
like
so funny.
It's like a Pavlov's dog thing, right?
Yeah.
Where they're like gonna condition you to hate your doctor. I don't know.
Yeah. That's so funny to me.
Less activation in the region of the brain known for experiencing pain. Again, it's a small study, and fMRI evidence is hardly perfect, but still, this type of study has persuaded Trzeciak that compassion can indeed modulate pain.
So I didn't say eliminate pain, but attenuate pain or one's experience of pain.
And what are the mechanisms by which this happens?
One of many potential mechanisms by which compassion can modulate their pain is the release of endorphins. So when endorphins are circulating, they are essentially natural opioids.
Tresiak also believes that compassion creates trust between patient and doctor.
In many ways, the touch of a trusted other can reduce one's experience of pain.
A study from the University of Haifa in Israel, for instance, gave people a painful stimulus while holding the hand of either a stranger or a loved one. Holding a stranger's hand didn't lessen the pain at all, but people reported a 50% reduction in pain while holding the loved one's hand. There's other research showing broader claims about human connection.
There's evidence that human connection also modulates or can affect one's autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that does everything that you don't have to think about, like controlling your heart rate and your cardiorespiratory system.
Tresiak points to evidence that compassion also affects what's known as the parasympathetic nervous system. This can boost the flow of oxytocin, a molecule known as the trust hormone. Now, of oxytocin.
Yeah, this my understanding is like, and maybe I'm wrong here, but my understanding is like, bedside manner is like not just like a meme, like that's something that is like specifically taught, and like there are like very specific things you're supposed to do because there's an understanding that it does actually help the patient. It does help produce better outcomes. So yeah.
A molecule known as the trust hormone. Now, these physiological benefits of compassion are, to me at least, quite surprising. Somewhat less surprising are the reported psychological benefits.
I don't know why it would be surprising.
That's probably intuitive to some extent, that treating someone with compassion can help their mental health. But we've also seen this in a study that we recently published here at Cooper.
This study was led by Brian Roberts, an emergency medicine doctor.
Brian did a study on the...
It seems like they're spending a lot of time just trying to convince us that compassion matters, but I don't really need to be convinced of that. I thought this was going to be more of like, what can we do about it? And we're like a third of the way done with this, and they haven't even started on that yet. I already believe them that compassion matters.
Effects of compassion and the subsequent development of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
He was studying people whose PTSD didn't come from war or some traumatic loss. It came from spending time in the hospital.
So approximately 1/3 of patients that go through the experience of critical illness in an ICU end up making diagnostic criteria for PTSD at 30 days. Even if you just come to the ER with a life-threatening medical emergency, 25% of those patients end up making diagnostic criteria for PTSD at 30 days.
Here's the hypothesis Brian Roberts wanted to explore, that treating ER and ICU patients with more compassion might decrease the prevalence of PTSD.
And what he found was that more compassion from the patient's perspective was associated with lower development of PTSD at 30 days. So perhaps compassion for people while they're going through terrifying medical emergencies can actually help them with their psychological effects down the road.
So I mentioned this compassionomics idea to one doctor friend of mine. He's a gastroenterologist whose specialty is cancer care. He's late 50s, early 60s. And he pushed back in the following way. He said that doctors like him used to practice lots of compassion because, he said, there wasn't much else they could do once someone was diagnosed with cancer. And now that there's so many more treatment options, that he'd rather deliver a lot of science than a bunch of compassion. So there's an opportunity cost argument to this, right? If we're going to spend a lot of time teaching and or focusing on these kind of softer skills, does the science suffer?
Compassion actually takes almost no time, like less than a minute. There was a randomized controlled trial from Johns Hopkins in a cancer population, and the primary outcome measure was anxiety. If you have cancer or somebody close to you has, you know that anxiety is pretty important. And what they found is that the compassionate care had a significantly better effect on the patient's anxiety level. But what was most striking is that it only took 40 seconds for the intervention. And we found 5 other studies which show that it is less than a minute. And some people would argue there should be no time dimension at all because it doesn't take any extra time to treat somebody with compassion.
I think a fair response back might be, okay, fine, you found 5 studies and it's less than a minute, but you're opening yourself up to a ton more questions. You're opening yourself up to a much longer visit, but that's also been studied. And there is no significant increase in the total length of time that people spend together. I think that the problem is that it is sometimes very hard in medicine to take on a new paradigm shift.
To say it's hard for medicine to take on a paradigm shift, that is an understatement. The history of medicine is replete with innovations that took years, sometimes decades, to work their way into the mainstream. Hand hygiene, for instance, as basic as that now seems. Medicine is a difficult enterprise, a complicated one, and in many ways a conservative one, with good reason. Remember, first, do no harm. So imagine you are a hospital administrator and some researcher comes into your office preaching the virtues of compassion. It has demonstrable physiological and psychological benefits, they tell you. It doesn't take much time or effort, they tell you. Is that enough to convince you to round up all your doctors and tell them, on top of everything else they're doing, that they also need to show more compassion to their patients? Maybe, but if not, what if that researcher also tells you that compassion will save you a lot of money? Are you paying more attention now?
So compassion, increased revenue, and decreased costs.
How can compassion increase revenues?
There's patients who will pay more for that. We have data about hospitals that have higher margins, that have better patient experience.
That's true, according to data collected by a federal survey of hospital patients. And hospitals that perform well on this survey are also reimbursed at a higher rate by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
But it's the decrease in costs that I think is the most interesting.
There is consistent evidence that when you care deeply for patients and they know that, they're more likely to take their medicine. And non-adherence to medical therapy in the U.S. alone accounts for somewhere between $100 and $280 billion of avoidable downstream healthcare costs.
And if compassion is something that can help people be more adherent, even capturing a fraction of that could decrease costs in a healthcare system, which is approaching 19% of the GDP. That's one way it can decrease costs. Another way is in studies where there's really patient-centered care, the proportion of patients who were referred to specialists was 59% lower, while those who underwent diagnostic testing was 84% lower.
I can see how fewer referrals to specialists and less extra testing would certainly lower costs, but how do we know that those lower costs aren't at the expense of better outcomes? Because obviously some referrals and some tests are necessary.
So there's a whole section of the book dedicated to the data on quality of care. And we've found associations in the data between more caring and fewer errors. And many of us in healthcare have been exposed to folks.
This stuff just seems so obvious.
Unfortunately,
it's like, yes, like doctors who care more about something are more likely to like adhere to it scrupulously. Patients who feel like they're in a more caring situation are more likely to take their medication. It just seems very unsurprising.
Yeah.
they're few and far between, who maybe don't care as much as we think they ought to.
Or they once did.
Right? If they're burned out. If you go to medical conferences, there is one theme that is drowning out just about every other topic that's being discussed, and that's the topic of burnout among healthcare providers.
Indeed, the World Health Organization recently added burnout to its international classification of diseases, not as a medical condition, but an occupational phenomenon. Plainly, medicine isn't the only occupation where burnout can happen, but as we'll hear after the break, it is surprisingly common among doctors. So what's this have to do with compassion? We'll find out, along with some potential solutions. That's right after this. Anthony Mazzarelli and Stephen Tresiak are doctors and administrators at Cooper University Healthcare in Camden, New Jersey. That's just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. They have co-authored a book called Compassionomics, which argues that when doctors treat their patients with compassion, it improves medical outcomes and reduces costs. But there is a problem.
There is a compassion crisis in healthcare.
How can that be? How can the most caring of caring professions be lacking in compassion? Before we get into the causes, would
Isn't
you
like burnout in these kind of
example?
fields like infamous?
Yeah, I mean, another thing is that question. It doesn't seem like it should be such a perplexing thing, right? Like sure, it's a profession that attracts compassionate people, but it's also a profession that demands a lot of compassion of you. So it's not super surprising that people might fall short.
And the subject matter of the profession as well can be quite taxing. Like imagine seeing people be very sick or in pain or even die, is probably a lot more taxing on your mental status than the average of.
Yeah, and a lot of healthcare professionals have to be on call, at all kinds of crazy hours and stuff. Yeah, it's a very stressful job from everything I hear.
Of course you would. You remember at the beginning of this episode, I mentioned a certain nasty and vulgar incident? Let me just pause here to emphasize that this example is not representative of most healthcare professionals. Most people who get into medicine do so because they want to help people. They take a vow to uphold a standard. But occasionally, that standard is violated. In 2013, for instance, a man went to have a colonoscopy at a medical facility in Reston, Virginia. There was the gastroenterologist who performed the procedure, an anesthesiologist, and a medical assistant. The patient planned to record the doctor's instructions on his phone once the colonoscopy was over, but he accidentally recorded the whole procedure. From his nervous questions before things got started.
Uh-oh.
Sorry I have so many questions. It's
Okay.
my first time doing anything like this.
To the doctors talking about him once he was anesthetized.
It's crazy.
They start talking about an earlier problem the patient had, a genital rash.
And he keeps mentioning it like it's the first time he's ever talked to anyone about it. I'm like, sir, you see two urologists. Well, what are you telling me for?
I'm
And
just
also,
saying.
not to don't mention it to me because I'm not interested.
And I don't care, exactly. And then he went on and on about it, and I'm like,
One of the nice things about being a specialist is I don't deal with that.
really not. One of the nice things about being an anesthesiologist.
That's why I didn't become a freaking urologist.
In case you didn't catch that, the anesthesiologist
That was really not that bad. I was like he could have been a little more diplomatic about it, but if he's a specialist and the guy's asking about something that is not in his field of speciality, it's okay to be like, yeah, Ben, I can help you here.
Yeah, it was a little bit nonchalant or whatever. I get that this isn't the most display of compassion you might ever find, but I don't know. Yeah, it didn't seem cruel or anything.
One of the nice things about being an anesthesiologist is making people shut the hell up. And then she continues, alternately talking to her colleagues and the anesthetized patient.
And after 5 minutes of talking to you in pre-op, I wanted to punch you in the face and man you up a little bit. So just make sure you get
That's a little much.
Okay, well.
Accidentally rub up against it. Some syphilis on your arm or something. It's probably tuberculosis in the penis, so I think you'll be all right. Just get a PPD in a month, and then you'll take some INH and be fine.
As long as it's not Ebola, you're okay.
So if you see a reaction, it's
Penis Ebola.
It's penis Ebola, she says, which is not a thing. Then she says she's going to enter hemorrhoids on the patient's chart.
I'm going to mark hemorrhoids, even though we don't see them and probably won't.
Even though we don't see them and probably won't.
I'm just going to take a shot in the dark.
This patient, after waking up and hearing the phone recording, sued the doctors. The gastroenterologist was ultimately dismissed from the case, but the anesthesiologist and her practice were ordered to pay $500,000 in damages.
Wow.
Again, This is just one incident and an egregious example for sure. But if you want to make an argument for the lack of compassion in healthcare, it's a good example. On the other hand, if you want to make an argument that having compassion can save you money, as Mazzarelli and Treziak argue, you can use this lawsuit as an example where the lack of compassion can be very expensive.
That seems kind of insane to have to pay $500,000 for that. I mean, I do think that's
what the breakdown versus. I imagine it has to all be punitive damages.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it must be, right? I mean, I do agree with them that that's bad behavior, but it just seems like that should be like bad behavior on the level of like slap on the wrist, like please don't talk to patients that way anymore. It's probably not bad behavior on the level of pay $500,000
yeah,
for that.
Say there is still a huge deficit in compassionate care. Here's Treziak again.
The data suggests that physicians specifically miss approximately 60 to 90% of opportunities to respond to patients with compassion.
Give me a simple example of
how could you possibly calculate that? I'm so curious what that is.
I don't know. That's weird.
Opportunities to that is a really weird way of that phrasing is really piques my curiosity.
A physician failing to exercise compassion.
Let's start with the most basic. Recent data from the Mayo Clinic show that physicians will interrupt patients in their statement of their main concern at the 11-second mark. That's the median time to first interruption. So patients may not even get to fully explain the main concern that they have.
This kind of problem is driven in large part by how doctors are compensated. As you likely know, our healthcare system tends to put more value on procedures and tests than on conversation or prevention.
Well,
this is hard for doctors themselves.
Okay, like putting more diagnostic value on tests than conversations is probably good. But then you said the part about prevention. I don't want to discount prevention, but I don't know what it has to do with the point he's making, though, actually. But anyway.
Frustrated that their profession, long viewed as a calling, has become so transactional. But there also appears to be a perception gap between physicians and patients. Consider a survey done by the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, which included 800 recently hospitalized patients and more than 500 doctors. When asked if most healthcare professionals provide compassionate care, 78% of the doctors said yes. For patients, that number was just 54%.
So that data, and there are other data to corroborate it, show quite clearly that many of our healthcare providers can have a blind spot with respect to how well they're connecting with their patients. We are thinking that we're providing them with the emotional support that they need, but the data show that that's not what we're actually delivering.
What's missing in this equation? It appears to be empathy.
Yes, empathy is a human capacity that allows us to perceive, process, and respond to others' emotional states.
That's Helen Reese. She is a Harvard psychiatrist who also practices at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she directs a program that does empathy research and training.
There have been many studies, both in medical students and in practicing physicians, that demonstrate that there is definitely a deficit in empathy and compassion.
Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the median American doctor's empathy level?
I'd say it's about 4.5.
Ooh, that's discouraging, isn't it?
I think so. And it's not to blame the doctors. I just think that our system right now is working to get the outcome that we're seeing. First of all, medicine has become a business, and whereas we used to have time to get to know patients and to really form relationships, it's much more about throughput now and how many people you can squeeze into an afternoon. The incentives are much higher to see somebody for 20 minutes to just prescribe their medicine than to see them as a whole person.
I don't know if they're going to gloss over this or not, but I feel like the point that she's just making is something I really want to emphasize, just in case they might gloss over it, which is that I think framing this in terms of having a good relationship between doctor and patient is probably like a better way to frame this than just the doctors are mean, right?
Yeah, and I think I think what they're about to get into is it's mostly the system surrounding it, and the stress that's placed on doctors. How often do doctors need to be working? How much work are they needing to do, et cetera, stuff like that. It's a lot more to do with the ways in which the healthcare relationships are arranged than even the relationships themselves.
Person.
Reese argues that this scenario is a big driver of physician burnout. How is that defined?
Burnout is defined when a few things are happening called depersonalization, where patients are seen more like as a number or a diagnosis, one on a list instead of like real people. A sense of decreased effectiveness, just feeling like no matter how hard I work, I just don't really feel like I'm doing a good job, and emotional exhaustion.
Last year, the National Academy of Medicine published a report putting the rate of physician burnout in the U.S. between 40 and 54%. That's roughly double the burnout rate among workers in other fields, even after controlling for hours and other factors. It's also estimated that the rate of physician suicide is double that of the general population, between 300 and 400 doctors each year.
In the general population, there are many attempts, but when physicians decide they have had enough, they know how to end their lives, and they have what's called a successful outcome. Of course, it couldn't be farther from the truth.
As bad as physician burnout has been in recent years, COVID made it worse. A recent Medscape survey found that 2/3 of the doctors who responded said their burnout symptoms had intensified during the pandemic. A quarter of them said they are considering early retirement, in part because their income has fallen. Nurses are also thought to have very high rates of burnout, although frustratingly, there's less data on nurses. And the lack of data on nurse suicide is even worse. Among doctors, burnout is known to start early. It's estimated that 44% of medical students suffer from burnout before they even make it to their residency.
I talk to medical students and residents all the time, and they say, when I chose this as a profession, I thought I'd be spending most of the time with patients, but the average resident spends about 12 minutes a day with their patient, and the rest of the time is all work done through the computer.
This is a complaint we've heard before on this show from Atul Gawande.
At this point, I'm a glorified data entry clerk.
And Gawande is among the most prominent physicians in America, a surgeon, public health researcher, and best-selling author.
Okay, well, first off, when you say that, I'm like, okay, I see why he's doing a lot more data entry than working with patients. But secondly, setting aside that as a particularly unrepresentative example, I'm curious because when they say something like that, the obvious solution that comes to mind is more administrative staff, right? Someone to do that work for the doctors,
to relieve them of some of the stress. Yeah.
But I'm curious because that is one of the most common complaints about the healthcare system is the administrative bloat. So I'm just curious what that's going to look like in a moment here.
I spend more time doing data entry in my office than I do seeing my patients, and that's just broken.
Well, can we pause?
People are feeling
I feel like the obvious answer to that would be to have more doctors so that they get to spend like more time per patient, right? Like
that could also help, yeah.
Yeah.
Exhausted, disconnected from the reason that brought them to the profession, and they're not feeling very effective in their jobs. Their morale is going to decay, and cynicism can start to creep in.
That would probably also bloat costs to have more doctors, but...
There is a cult novel published in 1978 called The House of God, which is still popular among medical students. It follows a group of first-year residents at work in the hospital. The House of God is their name for the hospital itself. Here's one passage. Before the House of God, I had loved old people. Now they were no longer old people. They were gomers. A gomer is doctor slang for get out of my emergency room. The passage continues. I did not, could not love them anymore. I struggled to rest and cannot, and I struggled to love and cannot, for I'm all leached out like a man's shirt washed too many times.
When I started medical school, compassion wasn't a part of the curriculum.
Anthony Mazzarelli again.
It wasn't a title of any lecture. It wasn't on any test.
And Stephen Treziak.
Classically, the teaching in medical education, and this wasn't taught as part of the formal curriculum, this is just what you pick from your peers, there's this thinking that don't get too close to patients because that could make you prone to getting burned out.
Treziak says the current medical school curricula are more likely to focus on empathy and compassion. He says there's no established standard for this kind of training, nor is it likely to be evidence-based, but at least the arrow is moving in the right direction. Also, there's new technology like virtual reality to help medical students learn to interact with patients. Here again is the psychiatrist Helen Reese.
There was a company that made this wrist device that helped you experience what it was like to have Parkinsonism. And when I tried it and I couldn't even hold a pen, I realized I had no idea how hard it would even be to write anything or zip up your jacket. And it instantly gave me more empathy for people who can't control their movements.
Some years back, Reese co-founded a company called Empathetics. It uses live and virtual sessions to teach anyone, but mainly healthcare workers, how to be more empathetic.
Empathy is how we perceive the emotional states of others, and that gets mapped onto our brain. So empathy is needed in order to show compassion.
So how does this translate into advice for doctors?
Empathy is in part a shared experience. And so if your patient is really worried about something and you're sitting there flatline, you're not catching any of the emotion. And we're not suggesting that you get it just as upset as the patient, but there should be a change in your physiology when something very emotionally charged is happening. And that's why if doctors are looking at computer screens and not catching a facial expression, and they're not really hearing it in the tone of voice, they can miss something that's extremely important to the patient.
Reese herself designed the program that Empathetics uses to teach empathy.
On a walk in the woods one day, it kind of came to me that the word empathy could act as an acronym for all 7 ways that we connect.
Okay, let's start with the E.
The first way that we connect with anybody is through eye contact. That says, I see you, you exist. And it goes back as early as mother-infant bonding, that a child knows they exist through the gaze of the mother or whoever's holding them. And oxytocin is released when people gaze at one another, and it bonds people. And in healthcare, when people feel afraid, small, and vulnerable, that gaze actually means a lot. The next letter is M for muscles of facial expression. And I had to use that because there's no F in empathy for face.
It's fair. There are muscles in the face.
Well, they are what shape our expression, so it works.
The idea here is that our facial expressions usually mimic someone else's concern or sorrow. The P in Reese's acronym is for posture or body language. A is for affect. The T is for tone of voice.
Well, affect
the
just
H
includes
is
all
for
of this
hearing
stuff,
the patient, the entire patient.
In medicine, it's so easy to focus on the injured body part, the pancreas that has abnormalities or the heart that's got a murmur. But we've got to back up and realize that all these body parts are attached to a person. And only caring about how your wound is healing is not going to make that patient feel very cared about, even though you've done a brilliant surgery.
And that leaves us with the why.
The why is the most interesting one of all, and that is your response. And it's not what you say next. Your response is your feeling of being with that person. Because most feelings are mutual. And if you're feeling good after an interaction, chances are the other person is too. But if you're feeling a little like something tilted there, we encourage taking some moments to reflect back on what just happened and ask yourself, was I abrupt? Did I seem rushed? Did I cut the person off? Did I not answer their questions? Like, when things are off, we should not just move on and say, oh, well, because oftentimes it's that gap where you kind of know something wasn't quite right.
Helen Reese's argument is that if you want to increase compassion among doctors and other healthcare personnel, you have to start with empathy.
Empathy is the prerequisite.
And if the empathy doesn't come naturally, or if it gets leached away over time, and if people have to be taught to exhibit empathy, well, that's what needs to happen. And there's one more reason why it needs to happen. This is the most radical argument that Stephen Trzeciak and Anthony Mazzarelli make in their book, Compassionomics. All that stuff about how compassion is good for patients, both physiologically and psychologically, that's not so radical. All the evidence that physician burnout is a huge problem, also not so radical. Here's the radical proposal. Compassion is not a one-way street. Its benefits accrue not only to patients, they argue, but to doctors and nurses as well. Compassion, in other words, will heal the healers. Several studies have linked compassion or empathy to lower levels of burnout. It's really hard for studies like that to prove causation, but researchers have documented physiological benefits of dispensing compassion. Sometimes it's called the helper's high, driven perhaps by a spike in endorphins. Dispensing compassion can also activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which produces a calming effect. Compassion, the thing that doctors need to show, is the very thing that doctors need. That, at least, is the argument put forth by Trzeciak and Mazzarelli.
The preponderance of evidence shows that there is an inverse association between compassion and burnout. So more compassion, lower burnout, lower compassion, higher burnout. Healthcare providers who have lower compassion for patients are more predisposed to getting burned out under the same amount of stress. So we believe that having a fulfilling doctor-patient relationship or a nurse-patient relationship gives you that fulfilling part of medicine. And if you don't have that, then it's just one stress after another.
Soon after Trzeciak and Mazzarelli began to focus on the science of compassion, they started a program at Cooper Health System to mentor physicians on how to connect and communicate with patients. Mazzarelli reports that the hospital has since made improvements every year in patient satisfaction, physician engagement, and financial performance. Although Mazzarelli, true to what he has learned during his Compassionomics journey, was careful to note that, quote, of course, we can only report association rather than definitive causation from these data. Let me ask you, since you were the skeptic coming in, Steve, I'm really curious to know what kind of effect this work, the research and writing the book and trying to put it into practice, what kind of effect that's had on you personally and or professionally.
Sure. So after going through all of the data and specifically seeing the signal that compassion can be beneficial for the giver too, that really left an indelible mark on me, because after 20 years of working in an ICU and meeting people on the worst day of their life, I came to the realization that I had every symptom of burnout, every single one. And I assure you that's not a good place to be. So having just synthesized all the evidence that compassion can be beneficial for the giver too, I decided to do an experiment on myself. And I tried very hard, and I still do to this day, working to connect with people more, not less. It's not only the patients for me, it's their families. Many of my patients are so sick they can't talk. They're on a ventilator, for example. But connecting more, not less, leaning in rather than pulling back. And for me, that was when the fog of burnout began to lift. And you also realize that you can get better at compassion. It can be taught, it can be learned, and you have to be very intentional in practicing it every day.
Can you give me an example or two of something that you say that you wouldn't have said, or maybe it's something that you say differently? Is it the way you touch someone that you might not have touched before? Is it eye contact?
Actually, it's not something that I say. Oftentimes, it's something that I don't say. It's just being present. I practice critical care, and there are a lot of times when the outcome is not something that can be changed. And sometimes you just need to sit with people and they're suffering. You're not going to go through this alone. I am here with you. In fact, just in the ICU recently, I had to give essentially news to a woman whose brother was fighting for his life. We were still hopeful that he could recover, but he was so severe that it was very likely that he might not. And it was devastating to her because he had been her rock throughout her whole life. And at the end of that discussion, she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't." And she said, "I wouldn't think that you would. You see so many patients here. It's okay. But 8 years ago, my mom was in that room right across the hall there, and you were her doctor. And we had to have this talk, and you had to tell me that she was dying and there was nothing that we could do for her." And what she remembered was the nurses and the fact that she never felt alone through that whole experience. She said, the kindness of your nurses and how they helped me through that. She said, it keeps coming back to me. It comes back to me all the time. I think about that because it was so hard at the time. But every time I think about it, I think about the kindness of those nurses. And so going back to what we were talking about earlier, even though there are 281 references in this book of original science research papers that show that compassion matters, even when it can't make a difference on the outcome, it still makes a difference.
Maybe it's too much to ask at this moment, but wouldn't it be nice if the science of compassion could perhaps be spread around throughout society, not just confined to medicine? If the people who receive empathy and compassion are left better off, and if the people who dispense it are also left better off, I can't see any reason to be stingy with it. Just a thought, do with it what you will. I will leave you today with the sign-off we've been using since early in the pandemic. It's a sign-off I now realize that indicates my own appetite for a little more compassion all around. It goes like this. We'll be back next week. Until then, take care of yourself and, if you can, someone else too. Freakonomics Radio is produced by Stitcher and Dubner Productions. We can be reached at radio@freakonomics.com. This episode was produced by Morgan Levy. Our staff also includes Allison Craiglow, Mark McCluskey, Greg Rippin, Zach Lipinski, Daphne Chen, Mary DeDuke, and Matt Hickey. Our intern is Emma Terrell, and we had help this week from Jasmine Klinger. Our theme song is Mr. Fortune by the Hitchhikers. All the other music was composed by Luis Guerra. You can get Freakonomics Radio on any podcast app. If you'd like the entire back catalog, use the Stitcher app or go to Freakonomics.com, where we also publish transcripts and show notes. As always, thanks for listening.
Okay, well, almost all of that was about why compassion is important, which I feel like I was about to say it's the least interesting part of this, but it's not like a complete waste of time. Like I get why it's worth pointing out that having better relationships between people is going to have a bunch of better outcomes. I do wish they would have gone into more detail about, like, you know, they mentioned, like, oh, we're giving training to people to have them, like, experience more compassion. And I felt like the only moment where they really, like, talked about how they were doing it was the thing where it was the nurse was experiencing what it was like to have Parkinson's and, like, couldn't hold a pen or something like that. But I wish we would have gotten more of that, right? Because, I mean, this is obviously, like they said, very applicable outside of the medical field. I feel like, you know, hopefully people aren't making it all the way to adulthood without having learned a lot of empathy and compassion growing up too. And
I felt like they were on the verge of, or they just barely touched on a couple things that were really interesting as to contributions, people getting burned out even in medical school. Is that suggestive that perhaps the requirements to be a doctor should be lowered? I mean, could that even have worse outcomes? Doctors spend so much time, entering data. Should we have more administrators? But, then the, administrative bloat is, one of the most infamous problems with, hospitals. So, yeah, I felt like a lot of the most interesting meat on the bone was left untouched.
Yeah, and also I have a little bit of a problem with them describing compassion like as a means to an end. It felt like that was how they were talking about it all the time, like as if it's not just okay, they're justifying it a whole bunch through the fact that it has good economic outcomes, which I believe, but it's just I don't know. It rubs me the wrong way a little bit to think that you would just have compassion because of the economic outcomes. Like hopefully you would just be good to the people around you regardless. But I think it's okay. I think it's okay to frame it in the sense of this is why we should be caring about. This is why we should care about compassion, not just as being nice, but actually no, it really helps people. So I can understand that angle, being guys, we need to take compassion a lot more serious. It's not just a social nicety; it is actually significantly contributing to health outcomes. Yeah, and I guess there's some value in pointing out that you should care about compassion not just in your own relationships, but compassion writ large across society, or because it has a bunch of outcomes that end up indirectly affecting you, regardless of whether you're practicing it and whether people are practicing it towards you. It still affects you secondhand in either anyway. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's it.
Okay, do you want to shout yourself out before we're done?
Twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace. I'm live every Wednesday here with Cricket.
All right, thank you very much. See you next time.
Yeah, I'll see you.